person, is from Imphal, um, is a vagabond by heart and a queer feminist by practice, and is got a, a compelling set of stories to talk to us today about the Northeast and the mix of identities that confront people who define gender stereotypes and gender identities from that part of India. The third speaker is more familiar and in my corner as an academic, Brian Horton, um, teaches anthropology at Brandeis University and has done some interesting work on the intersections of race, but is very familiar with India. So race and gender identity, but also very familiar with India and work in Bombay and in Bangalore, among others. So that's a brief introduction. I think you have the full introductions in your sheets. I'll hand over to Grace as we start, and that's your first 15 or 20 minutes.
Thank, thank you so much. I'm getting fear. Okay. Uh, I will start with this word. Trans community don't follow the caste system. Yes, believe that. I will give three kind of experience. One of my trans friend, who is a elderly trans woman, and she is a Dalit trans woman, and she is a chela of upper caste trans women, and she is regularly used to go to her guru's home. And one day she came, um, she ate her guru's home, and after that she's left to her home. She missed her room key, and she went to collect that key. And on the day she saw, uh, she ate that plates. The plates, they put it into the dustbin. And she suddenly saw that plate in the dustbin, and she was asked in the younger trans woman in that home, and she said, uh, every time we are following this thing. Why? Because of you are coming from this caste. And she's from the Arandadiyar caste, SCA. And she said, every time means, yes, every time they threw that plate, they can't use next time. Yes, believe trans community don't follow the caste system. And uh, well-known trans activist, uh, well-known trans activist, uh, they had a conversation in the public WhatsApp group, and they said, uh, you and she said to another activist, you and me have a Ram and Sabari relationship. So do you think it's not a casteist word? Yes, trans community don't follow the caste system. Believe in that. And I have third experience. Two trans people, trans teams have some issues. It's a family issues. They're all staying in one family, and they had issues in the COVID-19. Because of COVID-19, all the trans people persons are having mental issues. So and so much depressions, and they had fight to each other, and a group of upper caste trans persons, they came out to the home, and in front of the home, and they are all staying in the upper caste areas street. So they came out to the home, and in front of the home they shouted uh, to use that slur word, the casteist slur words. You can come out from the home, we are going to kill. And all the public people are listening that all the words and all the issues, and they are all kept silence. Nobody can come forward to support that Dalit trans people groups. Yes, trans community don't follow the caste system. In the rural areas, especially Dalit and Adivasi trans persons, we are facing so many discriminations because we don't have a privilege. We are in the hierarchy structure, the oppression structure. We are in the lowest level, and we have to fight with the caste system, and we have to fight with the transphobia, homophobia, fatphobia, Islamophobia, and we have to fight with the cis women, and we have to fight with patriarchy system, and we have to fight with the state and government sector. So, being a Dalit, being a Adivasi, we have to fight with every day. We have to fight with the whole hierarchy system. And where is our life? Where we have to live? No, we are also a human. We want to live as a fellow humans. And every day, our day is going to fight. But we still now we didn't live in this society, in this world. We want to peaceful life. And we love this world. It's like a beautiful garden. So we are also want to live with this society, but without this hierarchy systems. And the SC, trans people, uh, we have a very low level education and the economical backgrounds. So uh, within the queer movement, we have to struggle a lot because nobody can't express their feelings, that battle with the civil society, because their livelihood with the community, our livelihood with the community. When we raise the caste issues within the community, all the upper class Savarna persons and the queer persons join together and they attack us. Nobody should come forward to give the solidarity for us. So that is the fear we are having. And each and every trans person from the rural areas, we don't have a safe space to share our feelings. In trans, the Dalit Adivasi trans women, Dalit Adivasi trans men, we don't have a safe space. And Dalit Adivasi queer community, gender non-conforming person, and gender non-binary persons, our livelihood, it's completely going to double amount of struggle compared with the other trans persons. And the National Council. National Council, we had a discussion before. In that National Council, I have to say it's a Savarna National Council. It's completely Savarna people occupied that space. And where are our representatives from the Dalit Adivasi community? And the people who are all in that National Council member, they're all, and even the officials, cis community officials, people also very new about the caste issues in the Indian society. I want to share, remember that last year, Trans Act discussion, it's happened in the parliamentary, and uh, very less parliamentarian raised these issues. Trans people want the reservational rights. But that Ministry of Social Justice Empowerment, he openly said, no, we can't. So this is the state we are living. We are asking our rights. It's basic rights. We want to live with a dignified life. But you people didn't ready to give our rights. So we are ready to fight. Our battling is, our fight is going on. And that MBC reservation in Tamil Nadu, as per NALSA versus Union of India, we are following the reservation thing. All the trans persons, they put it into the MBC category reservation. If you want to use your caste reservation, you should have a community certificate. And the trans person's livelihood. We left from our home and we are facing the discrimination within the family circle, and we didn't get our certificates. So how do we give the proof? A and B. If we don't have a caste certificate and we are considered same MBC category, and if I face some atrocity, for example, I told that two upper class and Dalit trans persons groups had a fight, and that Dalit trans person went to the police station and they said, no, we don't file a SC/ST atrocity act because they don't have a caste certificate. So the COVID-19, during the COVID-19, all the metropolitan city and the upper class trans persons, upper class queer people, they're all getting so many benefits. Okay, I agree. You're also affected the pandemic situation, and we are also affected the pandemic situations. And being a Dalit and Adivasi people, we are staying in the rural area, very rural area. And I have to share one experience. One of our Dalit trans women who's a HIV infected trans person who wants to get the ART medicine, and she registered her ART center. She's belong, the based in Tuticorin district, but her ART center is a Tirunelveli district. We don't have a transport facility to get the medicine to travel the Tuticorin to Tirunelveli. It will take around, at least 20 to 30 kilometers. So we don't have a transport facilities, and she stayed in the very rural area. In the city, from city to her hometown, it's around 40 kilometers. And her IRT medicine got over. So we tried to, she called to us. We tried to get a medicine for her. And she's a folk dancer also. And that health inspector, that 1077, it's a helpline number. We try to call them, and that health inspector said, what is the ART medicine? So we said, I was like completely pissed off on that time, but on that time also we educating that government officials. And finally he said, okay, we will inform to the higher officials. So we didn't get a response one day. And next day, she didn't have a ART medicine. And before the 3 days before only, we heard the news in the Bombay, a trans woman who was killed herself. She was attempt suicide because she didn't get and she's also a HIV infected trans person. She didn't get a proper nutrition food. So from that, we strongly believe we have to protect that trans persons. So we tried to call our health minister, and the health minister team said they didn't respond, and they said, okay, we will do, and after that they didn't do nothing. And we finally called our district collector. We inform all the things, and we send the medical report and her medical reports. After that, he put the efforts, and the surrounding the 3 districts, Tirunelveli, Thoothukudi, and the Virudunagar district collector, they 3 of them are coordinate. Okay, we will give the ART medicine to on door delivery. We are giving the door delivery to the trans persons. And this trans person, we didn't have a transport facilities, and finally we got the medicines, and we traveled to give the medicine to her. So this is the situation in the society. So the people who have the privilege, they are only occupy, access the mainstream platform. And people like us, we don't have a underprivileged. We are in the underprivileged background. We don't have this. And finally, the rental house. We are all staying in the rental house, and the Dalit, Adivasi trans person, the rural area trans persons also, they are staying in the rental house. In the during the pandemic time, suddenly, the landlords, their mentality, it's like that only. They will tell immediately, please vacate our house. So this what happened in the various districts in the Tamil Nadu, and especially rural area trans persons. And that time, we didn't have a place to say. So the most of the, so in our home, we gave the accommodation, and I also uh, uh, went to the Tuticorin to visit that cooperative society construction work, and I also stuck in the Tuticorin district, and I also stayed in one of my daughter's home. It's very small, and in that home we are also gave the accommodation. We are staying together, it's a single bedroom home. We are staying together more than 16 trans person in the home during the pandemic. And the um, uh, it's in the legal perspective, um, new education policy. I have to talk about the new education policy. It says, we are talking about the Trans Act, but as well as the new education policy also suffer people lot. So we know this government is not for us. This government is for upper caste people. This government is for corporate people. So they form a new education policy. In that new education policy also, they mentioned the transgender persons, children in the schools. And uh, we from the Dalit community and the Adivasi community persons, we are facing too much discrimination in the school side, because in South Tamil Nadu, the caste is the root of the caste is it's from the school education. So the new education policy doesn't protect our community people, and it doesn't protect the trans community also. And it didn't talk about a single word about the reservation rights, reservation in the education system, and what are the abuses we are facing in the educational institutions, the mental abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse. They didn't talk about these three kind of abuses, and they didn't protect us from these three kind of abuses. And sorry, finally, uh, okay. Um, the I have to finish this word. Caste is everywhere. We are fighting for equality, and we are fighting to get a equity society. Thank you, Jai Bhim.
Thank you, Grace.
Yeah. I would also like to call upon Jay Santa and Thauzal to help me when there's a Q&A session, and also to fill in whenever necessary. Just also another disclaimer I want to say is that Northeastern as a category, to deal with it, to delve into the issue that it is something very new, I think, because I'll go into it as I speak about it. It's a very new process, and it's been there in the back of our mind, but really working on it has been very new, and so that's why I'm gonna go all over the place. And I don't know, even for my own self, I don't know where to begin and where to end. But I would like to bring in instances from my own life and from what I've heard from a few of friends who are from Northeast, to sort of throw a certain light upon it. And it is, even among ourselves, it's a working process to see how does Northeast as a category work for us. It does give a certain benefit, I would not deny that. At the same time, how does it act as a glass ceiling as well? But I think this particular point where it acts as a glass ceiling is something that we've been trying to come together and see whether it's not just an individual experience, but something that we can sort of throw light upon as a collective experience and work on it. Because what happened to us, we do not want the young people to go through it. And as you see, the development and also the sort of the funding that goes on development processes, and not just in terms of the NGO sector, but also in terms of the country as well. Not many of them reaches that part of the country. So a lot of them is going to migrate. If they've been migrating for a long time, they will keep on migrating. So what we can do for them, like what, because if I'm able to enjoy a certain space and a certain voice, it's because of certain people who did before me, and then what I can do for them and what we can do for them. That is where it's coming from. Um, so yeah, first thing is, if you ask somebody from Northeast who hasn't really stepped out from Northeast, what does Northeast mean to them? They will only talk about a certain uh, territorial boundary. But the stereotypes and the assumptions about what a Northeast means is not something that we know when we are there. It's something that was imposed on us when we first came out of that place. Myself, when I thought about myself as a Northeasterner, to me it was just a matter of the territory where I belong. And but the assumptions around it is something which came on to me, and it was a slow realization actually. There was a lot of things that was told to me by my brother, my sister, and a few other people who had studied outside of that region, and then who told me what are the things I'm going to go through. I couldn't make any sense of it at that time. But as I started living here and started to sort of like get on with my life here, assimilate myself to the situation here, and the kind of rejection, the kind of stereotype and the judgment that came towards me, so it's a very slow learning process. And most of the time, it looks like I am the only person going through. And just as how it is with caste also, and also with Islamophobia as well. Most of the time, you feel like it's a individual experience. But when you connect with a lot of people, you realize it's a collective experience, and that's when you start want to work on it together. Um, so where did this category originate? It doesn't originate in Northeast. It originated here in what we call as mainland, within quotes. And to be more precise, in North India. And I think this conversation would have been I would have had liked this conversation to have in North India rather than South India, because in my own experience, I think South Indian community, of course, there is still a certain disconnect, but I feel like I've also lived in Hyderabad, and I've also been in South India for 3 years in my life before I went to Delhi for my job. And I feel like over here, even though I face that sense of that being termed as this exotic other, but not from a sense of me being a lesser, just me being a different other. That's how I faced in South India. But it was when I went to North India when being other also was associated with the sense of being lesser, which I feel like is them who is the lesser because they couldn't expand their own little knowledge about themselves in the world and then put it on to us. Anyway, and what does it do? Um, um, what does it do is it does the same thing, which we call as othering. And where does it come from? It comes from fear. And particularly because the point is we are a migrant population, as I also observed in the first panel. So how do a certain localite person look at a migrant population as some people who are there in their region, living on their resource, and also sort of like throwing away their resource from them, which is really sad because India, as I know about it, when I learned about it in my school text as early as my, I don't know, kindergarten, they says unity in diversity. And I thought it was a land where diversity was appreciated, only to come to realize that no, it is not. It is all against diversity. Everybody wants to remain in their little group and clique group and just want to other each other. So it's come from that fear. Instead of sharing, it comes from demarcating a certain boundaries, demarcating certain ways in which you can exist in that area, but you will be marked out. So that's why I say this. That's why, that's why I say the glass ceiling here. And again, I think I would be really hypocritic if I say that we Northeasterners also do not do othering. I think we also do. There's reverse racism. I don't want to get into it because I think that is also something very important to talk about, because just as much as I crave for a space where I can be myself and without fear, that's the whole point. The fear that they have in me will come on to me once I start realizing myself And once I start internalizing myself as this Northeast and other, as this cultural other, racial other, that's when the fear get transferred onto me. Just how we internalize homophobia, transphobia, and all of that. So, so that's why. So the kind of things that I crave here as a diaspora, I also want to give that to the other diaspora that is there in Northeast. One thing which is really interesting is that you will not find a lot of Savarna people as a diaspora back in Northeast. And if you do find them, you'll find them holding good positions either in business or government spaces or all these corporate houses or whatever. But the majority of people, if you find any diaspora population there residing as a community there, then they are also from the marginalized community. A lot of Dalit population, Bahujan population, Adivasi population from Bihar, UP migrate to Northeast. Why? Because there nobody asked them about their caste, you know. But of course, they do go through that racial othering, uh, which again comes from what we face when we come here. The moment we step outside of that bound of Northeast, there is a certain fear, insecurity, and also there's a lot of intimidation that comes with it. And that we also try to do it there. So there's definitely reverse racism. Don't want to extend, say much to it. Um, yes, so it comes from fear. What does it do? It others, and it sort of limits us. Um, so yeah, but um, and another thing which I also have experienced is that sometimes when I go to a certain party, you know, it could be a house party or it could be a certain platform, and there is another not distant person there. One mistake that a lot of mainlander do is that, oh, you're from Nagaland, oh, you're from Manipur, oh, you guys must, you know, like have this instant sense of solidarity, but which is really not so. That proves that you don't know much about Northeast. I may not, I am an cultural other and somehow the enemy or whatever to the mainlanders in the recent past. But if we talk about the communities there, we have been living next to each other for a long time. Our history of conflict runs centuries and millennia, not just millennia and centuries, but like thousands of years. So just to assume that we will just find an instant sense of solidarity itself again is invisibilizing of the diversity and the cultural history of that region again. That's one thing I want to point out. Because as I said, the Northeastern category is fairly very recent. It can be traced a couple of years back. In fact, 20, 30 years back when, you know, like the modernization coming in, education coming in and all of that, and then people migrating for better opportunities. Otherwise, we had no reason to come out here. We were very self-sustained out there. It's just that with the development coming in, with this whole new world paradigm coming in, with new, I don't know what they call it, new liberalism, neoliberalism, whatever, with that coming in, that's when the need to migrate to the other cities came in. And so this category called Northeast, as we understand through assumptions and stereotypes of Northeast, is very, very recent. Um, and so if, yes, so again, another thing which I'm gonna jump into, I don't know how you're gonna relate it. The reason why I thought a lot about today, what am I gonna wear? Am I gonna wear a sari? Am I gonna wear, you know, like a Western dress? Because that's what a Northeast is known for. But the reason why I wore a Northeastern dress today is because I think this is these are the main coordinates in which we need to really look at this issue or this conflict or whatever we call it, that we are an exotic other and that Northeasterns are bold, bolder than us. That's, I mean, South Indian says it, North Indian says it, everyone says it. But the point is, what lies behind that exoticity? Maybe we are an exotic other. And it's really sad, and I mean, not always so sad, but I think the way sex, gender, and sexuality and the way it looks at, I mean, desirability and attraction is always, you know, like, it's really sad. The whole, again, the fat phobia, and then there is also a lot of stereotypes on beauty and, you know, standards of beauty and vagera, and all of this also comes in play when we talk about racism, because color is in play. Maybe Northeastern people do not have to face color color not so much in terms of, because we are considered as this exotic, beautiful other. So we're not the, you know, quote unquote black, you know. So, but the point is, you know, it's maybe, you know, it's easy to, it does provide a certain space whereby we get to get a certain limelight, but what is there after that limelight? There is nothing else after that limelight. After that limelight, there is this hollowness to it. because people will see us for how we look and how our skin are, and then they would not want to know more than that. And I'm sorry if this is too informal to mention in this kind of a stage, but they look at us, they look at our skin, they look at how we are, and their imagination goes as far as how we are going to be in bed or what they can do it to us on bed. And beyond that, our culture or whatever, nobody cares. Nobody, and most of the time it happens that when I speak in a panel as a North Easterner, I know that my time is that time when which is given to me to speak, and I don't expect questions to come because I know nobody is going to ask questions. But as I remember what Vikram once said in one panel that I attended, and I saw her speak, that if you have made the audience uncomfortable, if if that is the beginning of the movement, then if you made the audience uncomfortable, then that is done for that day, and then that's how I sort of like console myself. Um, yeah, so behind this exotic other lies a lot of insecurities and fear. Why? Because we don't speak. The point is, most of the times you find us silent. Most of the times you talk about how North Eastern community resides in these small little ghettos and small little groups. The reason why we do that is because of that, as I said, we feel like nobody's going to be interested to know about us more than what we think about here and now, but not about our past or not about our vision as well. So we don't want to speak. Second thing is, the conversations around us, because if you go back to Northeast, then you'll also find yourself in silence because you'll realize that you don't know anything about that culture there. When do you even begin until and unless somebody asks you a certain questions? What do you want to say about it? That's the reason why we're silent, because everything around us is all man-land. Just like how for a trans person, for a queer person, everything around us is all heteronormative, right? So one thing that I also came across was, it was back in Hyderabad Central University where I started becoming a little more political. One more thing is that we are not interested in Indian politics, and don't think of it as something like us being narrow-minded or us being like not having an intellectual capacity to deal with politics. The point is, it's just so distant. And what do we get by engaging with it? We will assimilate ourselves, but with that politics with which we're engaging, would they give us the same space that we have given them, or the same effort or investment that we're giving them? And when I talk about effort, I'm not just talking about representation, I'm talking about leadership. I think the Northeastern, as I say, it's a diverse region with diverse set of knowledge. Won't say completely different because we're not that. I mean, I am very close to you compared to somebody who is in UK or America. So I won't say completely different, but yes, it's sort of worlds apart. And hence, there is a very different perspectives in that region. And within that region, again, because of the conflict that I told you about, each one of us have developed our own different ways of lifestyle and look and philosophies. So there is a plethora of knowledge out there. And when you look at Northeast when you look at Northeast, it should not just be for representation, but it should also be for leadership. The same thing I say about the queer people. When you sort of invite a queer person to speak on sex, gender, and sexuality, it should not be just about talking about the violence that they're going through or the kind of their lived realities, but also to see that them, for the virtue of who they are and the kind of live experience that they have, what sort of observation have they made out of the world, and what new things can they say? And not just a new thing, but leadership. Try giving it. To the heterosexual people, you've been trying to rule this world and make it harmonious and peaceful for everyone for such a long time. Have you been able to do that? If you think you haven't been able to do that, give the mic and give it to another person. Just the same with a manlander. If you think you haven't been able to solve a certain cultural conflict among yourself, look to the other, which is very close to you, Northeast. That doesn't mean that we do not have conflicts of our own. We also do. But that is how it's supposed to be. So if I am assimilating myself to you, I also want the same back. If I am not going to get that from you, I am not going to be interested in your politics, no matter how old it is, no matter how much of legacy and how bold it is for you, I am not going to care because it's just mutual exchange, I think. It's the dynamics is mutual. Um, yeah, so yes, another thing is also talking about the diversity of that place. I also want to bring forward a few things. Again, just to give a little example on, especially on the trans realities. the kind of confines and the kind of struggles for Manipuri transgender people is different from the transgender people in Mizoram as well as the transgender people in Meghalaya. Because I can quote these three because there was a very recent phenomena that happened in these three states recently. First thing is exactly after the transgender protection rights bill, not on the level, not on the plane of discussion that's been happening all over the country, but on a very different level, from a sense of indigeneity and like identity. So 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 again, like when you look at Northeast, everybody think of Northeast as religiously just Christians all over. No, that is so wrong. Like it's, I mean, I think uh, it's like a mini India, as how, I mean, to really roughly put it, because the diversity there in terms of the language, the dialect, the culture, the food habits, so diverse in that little land. But yes, but cultural, those who sits on the power of culture still rules over it. So in Mizoram, it's a church. In Meghalaya, which we know as which is very popular for the matrilineal systems there. And something about Northeast is that they're very staunch about their indigeneity. So some sort of a cultural thing head is there, which sort of governs and resides over it. In Manipur, it is partly the this I won't say all the indigenous activists, but there are some indigenous activists who really don't know their indigeneity. And then I think Santa and the book Faida, sort of is a big example of that. That how diverse that land was before, but now I think and it also actually comes when with Savarna, with Vaishnavism. There's a lot of purity and pollution system in Northeast, and that particularly came not in Northeast, I would say in Assam. I won't even call Assam because it's a stretch of Deccan Plateau, but still a certain other parts of Assam, as well as in Manipur, who took to Vaishnavism as compared to the rest of the other state who took to Christianity. So this sense of purity and pollution among the people there came in from that time. It was not so much before. There was some disparity, but not in this very strict sense of it. And there was a certain cultural transformation that happened. Like Meitei community was known for as a meat-eating culture, as a group of people who used to brew alcohol, just like the other Nagas and Kukis and Paitis and a lot of other indigenous communities that reside in Manipur. But because we took to Vaishnavism, now Meitei people do not cook meat at home. Meitei people do not brew alcohol at home. And this is a very recent thing, of recent past, especially after Vaishnavism came into that area. So yeah, so in Manipur, it's this sort of indigenous activities who really don't understand their indigeneity, them, and the we all know about the revolutionary groups out there, them. They do a lot of, they are the one who does a lot of violence upon trans people, upon on how, whether they can exercise their identity or whether they can express themselves the way they want to. In Mizoram, it is the church, Christianity and church and all of that. In Khasi, in Meghalaya, it's the Khasi Indigenous Council. And right after the protection, the bill came out, not really going into the flaw of the bill or whatever, but just these rights that transgenders will be able to enjoy as a way, I mean, that they can assert their identity, they can, like all of this. So all these indigenous communities got up against it, and this is something for, I mean, I will leave that as a homework for all of you to go and dig into this. I won't speak much about it. Um, so yeah, um, I want to then jump to my diaspora experience, where when I look at my, I've been in the field of gender, sex, sexuality, and queer activism since 2009, ever since I was in Hyderabad. And I did fairly a lot of work in Hyderabad at that time. And I mean, not comparable to the people like Vajanti who does incredible work nowadays. It was just starting at that time. We were just trying to group people. And I just took that opportunity to be among those people. And that's why I call Hyderabad my second home. Then coming to Delhi and when I came to Delhi, I identified myself as a feminist. I was not just some young student who was doing things. I identified myself as a feminist, and I also later on in my engagement with the kind of feminist spaces there, identified myself as a queer feminist. So I worked, first thing I worked was on working on men and masculinity for a lot of years. And I also worked on creating safe and shared space for women and girls for a lot of years. Then finally, I worked with Nazaria Queer Feminist Resource Group for the past 2 years, which is basically on queer issues particularly. But if you ask me during those times, did I get to really use my perspective and thoughts as an artist? And no, I had to assimilate myself into the mainland context. And I did got a lot of opportunity. And then and because every time somebody takes an interview of me and asks me how has been your struggle, I say, I don't think I struggled. I was just picked by a lot of people. Thankfully to them, I am where I am. But 10 years later, being part of that progressive space, when I look at my experiences, I started feeling a lot of guilt towards my community because I am known as a person. People know me. There's a certain idea of me in the people, and people expect about. But then what they're expecting from me is to speak a mainlander context, and that mainlander context for me is a constant struggle. It's every day. First and foremost thing, as I said, I don't speak your language. I don't know your history. I don't know your culture. I come from a very different space. So then, and again, like every day, I have to keep up with it. So this identity that has been passed on to me is a very good identity for me, letting me access certain spaces and opportunities. But it's something that is something I have to keep up with every day. Um, so so for example, like if I am wearing sari, I love sari. I mean, despite the whole cultural context, I think it's a lovely piece of like clothing, and I love sari. But when I wear sari, there are certain times when my notice and identity is invisibilized. That I wouldn't like. Or the fact that it's an artisan body wearing a sari and it's exoticized. That also I wouldn't like, you know? And when I wear a fanek, how is it that I get a very differential treatment as compared to when I wear a sari? Or when I wear or when I wear a Western dress. So when I wear a Western dress, it will be perceived and conceived in a very different light than you wearing a Western dress. Why that again? And as I said, there is certain benefit to this category because I think the point is when you make your entry into a certain space which is foreign, culturally, linguistically, in a lot of ways, what you're trying to do is create a space for yourself first. So there's stereotypes and I'm also a bit sorry, and also I don't know. I mean, there's a certain guilt in me towards Dalit Bahujan identity here in mainland. Of course, we're also tribals, but as Shanta also said, our sense of tribal is very different from the sense like how tribal culture, conceptualization is here in mainland India. So when we go into a certain space like that, we're trying to find a space to begin with. So these stereotypes and assumptions work as a space because I don't have to create something new. It's already there. So and as you see, like I wouldn't also tag the entire India as, racist. I mean, they're lovely people, are really amazing. So that sympathy and that, that they feel like they should do something for us, those are the spaces from where we begin our life here. And when I say life, I'm talking about trying to sustain it here. Why is that? You see a lot of Northeastern people flocking into your cities and living here, but just take a look. How long do they stay in your city? Not more than 5 years. Give it 10 years, they will all go back home. Why is it that they have gone back home? Back in Northeast, we know that the Northeast region do not have that much resources. They have spent most of their youthful, energetic, and resourceful life time here. But why is it that they are not able to sustain themselves here, and why do they have to go back? And about trans people as well. When we talk about it, yes, of course, I will talk, yes, we do get a certain amount of attention from the men. I would talk about the trans women and sex work. We do get a certain amount of attention, and we do get a certain amount, from men around here because we look exotic and all of that. But the point is the fact that we don't speak the same language, the fact that we're not from here puts us in a very vulnerable positions. So those attentions maybe in the, what do I say, in in a grinder space, or in that space, when it's good. But when inviting that attention over to my home, I have to think so many times before I do that. There was one post that came up recently in an Insta story where this girl was talking about how they saw a lot of men out there in the street, drunken and brawling. What she did was she suddenly felt so vulnerable because of her gender. Then she had an idea. She started citing Ram, 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 Ram. Suddenly, from being a woman, a lesser gender, she became a sister because of that. We cannot. Look at us. People know we're not. I mean, if I say Ram, 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 they will be suspicious of me rather than thinking, anything else. So these are the things that we face. Yes, there is certain spaces. Yes, we do tap into those spaces because we have to begin somewhere. Because when we all of us know why we migrate from a certain place. Because we're aspiring for something else. We're mostly it's development, mostly it's a better life, with better resources. Or maybe because you want to see the world, you feel like you don't want to be confined in a space, you want to go out in the world, and that's why we do it. So we have to begin somewhere, and that's why we have to tap into these stereotypes and assumptions that exist out there. Because to begin from some nothing is going to be a little more difficult, but at least when you step into that place, when you find at least a little corner which is for you, maybe you'll find shelter for some time. But that is not the end. That is just a shelter for some time. I left my family. I left my culture. And I am here because of certain aspirations. That aspirations is not going to be limited by this little space you give it. Look at the distance I traveled all the way from Northeast till here. Maybe I have a lot of aspirations to travel all the more. Or maybe within yours, maybe I don't want to get out of your state, but within your state, my reach in your state, I want to be. I want to be you. But are you ready to make me one of you? That is the question here, I guess. Um, yeah, so I will sort of like try to wrap it up.
In a minute.
Yeah, 1 minute. Just 1 minute, right? So I've told you about why are we silent, disconnect. I think all of this, and I was struggling to sort of see how do I contextualize my experience with this uh, conference. But I think all of what I said has a direct relationship with Constitution of India and the rights as a citizen. Says right to association, right to self-expression, right to be heard and understood, right to live and settle anywhere in the country, whatever rights you call it. It's just a matter of what effort, how much of an effort are you willing to see, and how much are you willing to be with me in in my effort to understand my own realities amidst your all of you, and what can I change about it. Um, yeah. Um, yeah, and what can we do is that, oh, another thing I want to mention is this. There was this women trans um, queer rally against CAA NRC in Delhi. I was part of that organizing team. It was a very fantastic effort, very progressive, very inclusive of our times. But I will want to say, I mean, so me and a few other, so there was a group of people from JNU who organized themselves within JNU and who are also organizing the Northeastern Fraternity in Delhi. We also decided to do one protest as a series of protests that every group which was part of their organizing was doing and where we can do. And we did that in the city. It was so sad because when we did it, I think it was just us Northeasterners who were there. But if you look at all the other protests happening in your city as well as I come from Delhi, so I know more about Delhi. If you look at all of the protests and a lot of these spaces for social justice, give it as, be it as broad as social justice, you'll always find some Northeastern people there and who will stand for that cause from the core of their heart. But when some atrocities happen on Northeast people, Bangalore is also very, I mean, Bangalore is also, I think a lot of trans people and a lot of queer people love Bangalore because Bangalore is one of their destination. But Bangalore is also known for certain racial violence against Northeast. I don't want to comment on that, but talking about Delhi, like when some sort of a violence happen to Northeast people, and when Northeast people congregate together in protest against it, we find, I mean, all this feminist and queer activists and progressive people, they hardly come. I mean, I want to raise the question there, you know. So what we need to do is, um, yeah, so I think if we really look at what I've shared right now, maybe it doesn't really pertain to a transgender experience or blah, 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 but I think the commonality we can draw here is what, you know, like a Dalit person would say against a Savarna person, what a queer person would say towards the heteronormative society. It's just that how does our internal prejudices create disabling environment for each other? And that is something we really need to look into. And these are not so clear on our face as we see. These are all within judgment. Prejudices are not so clear. It's so easy to quote them with sugar coating and blah 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 blah. But I think it definitely needs a certain, and it can, and I don't think representation can itself deal with it. Representation is the start of it. What it really requires is a certain philosophical, ideological, I think it was also mentioned by one of the panelists before as well. It really needs a lot of churning, and and it only begin with our interest. I won't even say patience and tolerance, because I know Grace would also agree with me. Done with your patience and tolerance. You've been patient and, and tolerated our voices enough. No, we want actions here, and that is very important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pavel. So, do we have Brian on?
I'm here. Can you all
Brian?
see me and hear me?
We can't see you
I
yet.
think
Just give us a second. Yeah, I think
okay.
you're on now. Please go ahead.
Okay, cool. I'm here. I'm present. This is my first time presenting at a conference via Zoom, so I'm still figuring things out. I wanted to start first of all, and I have 20 minutes for this, right? Just to be
Yes.
sure.
Yeah, that's
Give or
right.
take.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So I wanted to start first of all by thanking the Center for Law and Policy Research, as well as VQ for inviting me to this. It's 6 a.m. here, so I hope I don't come across sounding a little too loopy or crazy or emotional. It's just that that time of the morning. I also really want to thank Grace and Pavel for allowing me to share the space on the stage, I guess, behind you. It is really an honor and a privilege to be able to think out loud with both of you. I've sort of followed your work along with VQ's for a really long time, and I really feel happy and proud about the kinds of work that you all are doing, and that you're allowing me to kind of bear witness to it. As perhaps somewhat of an unfamiliar face to many people in the audience, I thought I would just introduce myself again. So my name is Brian Horton. I go by he, him, his. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. My primary fields are anthropology, women, gender, and sexuality studies, and I specifically focus on queer studies, critical race studies, and South Asian studies. So all of my research is based in India, most of it in Bombay. I've been traveling to India for the last 8 or 9 years, mostly to Bombay, where I've done most of the research for the book I'm currently writing. I'm going to talk today about 2 projects, the first one a little less and the second one quite a bit more. So the book I'm currently writing is a book called Shimmers of the Fabulous. And in that book, I ask what I think is a relatively innocuous yet hopefully provocative question, which is, can queer and trans life in India be thought of as fabulous? And in this project, I sit with a range of spaces, so parties, cruising sites, pride parades, virtual worlds, and I sit with these spaces in all of their beauty, but all of their complexity and fucked upness at times. And I want to explore the kinds of creative, pleasurable, and at times joyful worlds that queer and trans people produce in spite of ongoing legal debates about queer life. In thinking with and against longer histories of queer representation in India, that compel public reproductions of suffering, trauma, or crisis. So for instance, think about the ways in which legality demands that trans people visibilize their pain, or that gay people sort of present their suffering in order to gain rights. I instead ask and wonder how the archives and materials that I'm working with offer troubling yet potential instances of ordinary practices of freedom through desire. Or to think with queer of color scholar Jose Munoz, how a desire for things yet to come, things that are unfinished, or futures that have yet to be realized might actually be the substance of queerness. And that's the book I'm currently working on, but I was kind of called by VQ to present on this panel, which is about race, gender, and caste. So I thought I would talk a little bit more about my next research project, which I was supposed to kind of do some work on this past year. I was in India from December 2019 until March, and then COVID happened and I had to leave very quickly. Otherwise, I would probably still be stuck there. So in my next project, I explore what I'm calling the queer life of anti-Black racism in India. Sitting between Delhi, Bangalore, and Bombay, this project builds on my ongoing interest in the scenes of racial encounter between recent migrants from the Black diaspora and Indians living in major urban centers across India. I'm primarily going to look at Delhi, Bombay, and hopefully Bangalore at some point. And in the beginning stages of theorizing forms of racial consumption, so things like eating, sex, spectatorship, so watching or witnessing, to explore what I'm calling the queer life of anti-Black racism. So from films like Priyanka Chopra's Fashion, which I'm sure many people in this audience have seen, with that very horrid climax scene where she sleeps with a Black man and then suddenly has an emotional breakdown, to gossip about Africans living in India as cannibals, which appear often in local newspapers, to videos of attacks on Africans in public spaces. This project seeks to explore the kinds of trouble that Blackness poses, not merely in public spaces like the bylanes of neighborhoods like Kirki in New Delhi, but also as a larger problem for thought and for thinking about contemporary forms of violence, exclusion, marginality in India. So how do we add questions of anti-Blackness to the sort of already existing archive of violence and marginality that is quite robust and that we can sort of talk extensively about? So in this panel, which is aptly titled Caste, Race, Gender, Thinking Through the Intersections of Trans Identity, it may seem a little strange that I'm talking about race and that I'm talking about anti-Blackness. But part of what I'm wanting to do in thinking out loud with this next project is to show the ways in which I think this question of race and racism that's unfolding in major urban areas in India is itself a queer problem, and is also a problem for how queer politics is organized and organizes itself in India. And so I'm going to kind of take what will sort of be some seemingly long detours to get to, I think, what I'm suggesting is sort of the larger intervention of this project. One of the things that I think sort of shapes both my current project on sort of queer representation in India and this new project on race is I'm deeply interested in questions of beauty. That was a thing that came up a lot in my field work. So particularly when I was talking to sort of young urban gay men in places like Bombay, they would always talk about knowing that being gay meant that they needed to become more beautiful or more attractive. And what that meant were particular habits around consumption needed to change, particular forms of dress needed to change. They needed to put on more muscle weight or not be fat, etc., or not be so femme. And what the sort of question of beauty curated for me in those conversations was that a lot of the violence that we're talking about when we talk about queerphobia and transphobia is not simply a violence that exists at the level of the law or that exists at the level of the state. Some of it is so deeply ingrained in the kinds of categories that we imagine in our sort of ordinary daily lives as beautiful or as desirable. So for instance, I think when Pavel was talking, she was talking about sort of this idea of how Northeasterners are exoticized, right? And in fact, she actually made a reference to Blackness. And I think that those kinds of subtle nuances, right, around the ways that certain forms of life are imagined as being more desirable or less desirable than others, right, to me really shapes the contours of this project. So thinking in this new work I'm doing on race, I'm trying to think about how questions around anti-Blackness are also coinciding with these larger, what I would call kind of nationalist beautification projects. So if we think about the kinds of neoliberal reforms that are happening across India, if we think about the recent mess with things like Love Jihad in Uttar Pradesh and the sort of hubbub that's been made around that. These are all these sort of projects that are really talking about what the state, but also what sort of dominant ideologies imagine as beautiful futures, or a kind of the forms of presentation and desirability that should be represented, right, as being part of sort of India's sort of national future. And I'm kind of really trying to unpack the ways in which Blackness intervenes in those conversations. So what I want to do is talk very briefly about some examples of some of the incidents that I'm working with in this project on race, and hopefully swing back to talk about how I think I can connect them to the larger issues around transness and also caste. So the first instance is from Delhi in 2017. So this involved a student named Manish Kardi, who was a class 10 student from Greater Noida who went missing from his home. With no indication of his whereabouts, his family, friends, and neighbors combed the streets in search of him. As the hours passed, rumors swirled that neighbors had seen Manish socializing with 5 Nigerian men who lived 2 doors down from the flat where he and his family resided. So when a mob comprised of Manish's family and other colony residents barged into the home of the Nigerian men who lived in this locality, they found absolutely no trace of Manish. According to several reports in major newspapers that would later chronicle the events, the mob searched these men's refrigerator. With no signs of Manish in the apartment, the mob's logical conclusion was that the 5 men must have eaten him, cannibalized him without leaving so much as a bone or leftovers. Though Manish eventually made it home, he was experiencing a severe drug high and was eventually taken to the hospital by his parents, where he later died. Soon after Manish's death, his family members organized what was supposed to be a silent protest to commemorate his life and supposedly reclaim this neighborhood. The group walked through the streets of Noida holding signs that said that Nigerians were unwelcome and that they were criminals that needed to be sent home. And so the intensity of this moment eventually erupted into what became a full-out race riot, where CCTV cameras and grainy footage from those cameras captured mobs of men from this locality in Noida violently attacking anyone who, quote, looked like a Nigerian, which we can unpack the fraughtness of what that even means. And so in fact, if you see some of the video, it's really troubling footage of one man who is basically face down being attacked with dustbins, projectiles, people throwing fists, people tearing at his clothing. And this was in fact one of the videos that went sort of viral around the world, but particularly in India, so much so that the external minister, or the Minister of External Affairs at the time, Sushma Swaraj, sort of had to chime in, and she said that it's not right to connect attacks on African students with racism. She also added at the time that India, as the land of Gandhi and Buddha, could not possibly be racist. Now, anyone who studied Gandhi's history, particularly when he was in Africa, knows that Gandhi was actually deeply racist. In 1908, you know, he was jailed and arrested for refusing to carry an identity pass. And in his notebooks, he actually wrote about how he was frustrated at the fact that he was jailed in the same cell with Kafirs, which was the derogatory term used for Black people. He thought he should have been jailed with white people. And so this is that kind of history. And so part of what I'm arguing in this project is that Blackness in everyday life in India is menacing in its dominant existence. So alongside cinematic representations of Black people, which I look at and I can talk more about in Q&A, are these ordinary and circulating anxieties about the so-called encroachment of waves of African migrants into urban centers across India. So these translate into insults like Kalu or Kalia, They translate into discrimination in housing, racial profiling, and widespread belief that Africans are drug peddlers, prostitutes, and prostitutes. It translates into vigilante mob violence against African nationals. African nationals even talk about being openly taunted in the streets, with shopkeepers and passersby holding their noses when Africans move through public spaces. And in fact, this particular point kind of aligns with something I heard and saw when I was living in Bombay doing field work for what was then my dissertation project, which was on sort of queer activism and queer life in Bombay. I was shadowing a group of HIV outreach workers, and out of nowhere, you know, this one Koti said, I could never sleep with a Nigerian man. They smell like meat. Or they smell, and it's probably from eating too much meat. So there was this connection made between desirability, race, and food consumption habits. And so in addition to kind of doing the work of echoing Black people as prostitutes, drug dealers, and cannibals, right? This phrase about Nigerians eating too much meat or Africans eating too much meat and thus being sexually undesirable also echoes the same kinds of things that are said about Muslims, the same kinds of things that are said about people from the Northeast, and the same kinds of things that are said about people from Dalit and Adivasi communities. And so what I want to say is that this scene of anti-Blackness points to what I think are the important sites of convergence between the violences of race, the violences of ethnicity, and the violences of caste, right? In particular, that anti-Blackness can often speak in the language of casteism, but I also want to be cautious about collapsing these things together as being the same, right? I think that I've seen a lot of talk recently about anti-Blackness as just kind of an extension of Hindu Brahminical supremacy. And I want to say that I think that what Africans living in urban centers in India are experiencing is something radically different in some ways from the violence of caste. It's not to say that they have no common point of connection, but to say that there are also things that are unique to this particular case, which is also a story about migration and movement and a global conversation, right, around anti-Blackness. And Black life is sort of devalued globally in ways that I think are important to tease and pull apart. And what struck me a lot about scenes like this one, where a group of sort of queer, trans, Koti identified queer activists were sort of trading what was essentially an anti-Black joke, was that they were also fighting for recognition themselves, right? These were people who were constantly in the police officer, in police stations, in doctors' offices, working with lawyers and judges, asking, right, for particular forms of humanity and dignity to be given to them on the basis of their gender and sexual identity. And so it struck me that even in these moments where there's a so-called kind of radical queer or trans politic, right, there is still this kind of slippage in which Blackness is the other that can still be sort of picked and pulled apart. This really goes, I think, to one of the points that Grace raised, that even in talking about trans as a category, there are still categories within the category wherein violence, right, repeats itself and emerges in ways that do sort of further harm to people who are already, right, sort of socially stigmatized and harmed. And so I think this is a point across all three of our comments that might sort of be an important thread. Just checking my time. What I want to add here is that my time in India has reaffirmed for me that anti-Blackness is indeed a queer issue, one that exceeds small talk in the lanes of places of Mumbai Chawls, right? So for instance, in 2016, in his piece for the Daily O, titled "Indians Are Racist, but Africans Not Nice Either," queer scholar Ashley Tellis attempts to distract us from the virulent forms of racism experienced by Africans living in India, as well as experienced by Northeasterners, by rehearsing tired tropes of Africans as criminals, drug dealers, prostitutes, and homophobes. He writes, quote, "But I have not found Africans the friendliest people to me at all. I lived in Kishangarh for over 5 years, and my homosexuality saw them being quite hostile to me." He continues in this article to suggest that their refusals to mix in with the local population makes Africans, quote, "like the people from the Northeast," end quote, who are, quote, "egregiously endogamous, do not mix with mainland Indians, and are quite racist to us too," end quote. Beyond this facile conflation of Northeasterners and Africans as belonging to supposedly, well, at least for India, nebulous categories like race, Tellis's words not only erase extant and fabulous instances of Northeastern and African queerness, but also stage race as a multifaceted problem for both heteronormative society's order and queer safety. And what I mean by this is quite simple, that both Africans and Northeasterners are constructed as simultaneously undesirable and dangerous subjects because they threaten the order of heteronormative social spaces and housing societies with their food, their dress, their noise, and their sex. And yet at the same time, their assumed homophobia, and perhaps also transphobia in this formulation, mark them as simultaneously threatening to the lives of queers like Tellis. Holding up the fiction of African homophobia repeats the move that is often made by Suvarnas when pushed on their casteism or Islamophobia, to paint Dalits and Muslims as inherently anti-queer and Dalit Muslim queers as being in need of saving. And think here about the sort of more recent discourses that have emerged in the wake of what's happening in Kashmir and Jammu, for instance. The supposed intolerance of the Black, Dalit, Muslim, Northeastern figure comes to stand as sound justification for their violence and discrimination. And there are a litany of other examples I can point to here. So for instance, in 2014, when Somnath Bharti, who's part of the Aam Aadmi Party, led a vigilante raid against a group of African women in Kirki Extension, Delhi, and basically forced these women to give a public urine sample. Or in a 2018 incident in which a mob surrounded a house in Delhi occupied by Tanzanians and Nigerians because there were rumors that they had abducted children and were cannibalizing them. What I'm suggesting that in all of these different iterations, that by connecting African nationals to social ill, Blackness is vilified within larger social milieus, and social ill is displaced from larger structural inequalities to African immigrant communities. So Africans become the blame, right, for all of the things that detract from India's sort of neoliberal rise and ascendancy. So crime, poverty, prostitution become Black problems. And that is an issue that I think needs to be unpacked. And so what I'm arguing in this project and what I want to think about out loud is how Blackness poses more than just a racial problem. So one rooted in uneven and unequal distributions of rights, political recognition, or socioeconomic opportunity. What I want to say is that it's not about making better laws. Blackness is, what I'm arguing, an aesthetic problem in many of the ways that caste, religion, class, ethnicity, transness, and other marginalized subject positions pose similar aesthetic problems. By aesthetics, I reference something more than a philosophy of theory of art or beauty, but I really mean a way of inhabiting a space, a particular location, a way of looking and becoming. As anthropologist Lawrence Cohen suggests in his writings on fashion, in this case, he's talking about dress as a form of social mobility, he says that, quote, beauty as a project and demand is one way for thinking about the differential stakes in futurity. So in the future, so we think about the future or we imagine the future through the ways in which we understand what is beautiful or what is desirable. So for a lot of gay men, right, marriage and children is imagined as a beautiful, desirable future. And what I'm trying to say here is that anti-Blackness emerges from an imagining of a future life in India in which Black people are not part of that equation and ought not be part of that equation. And I'm saying that that's akin to the ways in which other marginalized subjects are also radically erased from futural politics in India. So what I'm arguing here is that for Africans in India, these differential stakes emerge at the same sites where Black bodies come into social view. Their disrupted entries into narratives of film or into the lanes of places like Kirki can produce not simply reactions of revulsion and horror, but also expose aesthetic regimes that color future aspirations of development, modernity, and progress, to which Blackness is seen as neither in alignment with nor desirable in and of itself. So similarly, the sound of the Hidra's clap, the Hindutva panics over love jihad, the ongoing Suvarna anxieties about justice for Dalits are also aesthetic problems. The entree of Africans, Muslims, trans people, and Dalits into spaces cordoned off for dominant communities curates narratives of social undoing and upheaval. So for instance, if we look at the Trans Act's need for certification panels and to criminalize sex work and begging, and to paint trans people as victims in need of saving, this is about refusing the kinds of unruly behaviors that dominant, mostly Suvarna sort of politicians imagine as not being part of a more sort of progressive neoliberal India. And so what I'm arguing is that, for instance, the way these kinds of acts of rescue and reform, which are akin to the same projects that are rehearsed on the bodies of sex workers, hereditary performers, Dalit women, and a range of other social groups, and aspire to enact nationalist programs of beautification through reproducing state desires for social and sexual control. So thus, anxieties expressed over individual, communal, and social undoing, so this kind of panic in the case I'm looking at of Black people living and thriving across various cities in India, isn't about speaking the language of law or politics, right? These anxieties are not just about like illegal drugs and about prostitution. They're really about a larger sense of the kinds of hope and aspiration that people put into sort of public life and public spaces. And so under the guise of words like modernity, development, rights, and even at times freedom, what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps one of the connections between anti-Black violence and the experiences that trans people, that Dalit people, that Muslims are facing in India is that these communities are incredibly freighted by the immeasurable burden of responsibility for these kinds of neoliberal dreams of progress, desire, futurity, success, right, that India is aspiring to. And in an attempt to sort of shore off, right, the structural reasons why violence continues for these communities, right? The claim is to just say, well, these folk are backwards and are clearly not doing enough or not doing their part to sort of help in this larger narrative of sort of liberal sort of progression. And so I'm really in this project and hopefully in this conversation trying to think out loud about how the kinds of experiences that I'm looking at when I'm thinking about this project on race are, again, to sort of quote one of my favorite kind of Indian English phrases, same but different. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Brian, for being up and not sluggish in the least. So the panel's got us to 5:05. We have 25 minutes, and I'll open it up for questions or comments as soon as I see a hand. If everyone's going to be patient, I'll step in. Okay, so I'll give the audience some more time. I just have a question for each of the panelists, and I'll start with Brian and go in a reverse order. It's interesting that in the intellectual history of the anti-caste movement, that there was a point at which there was a rejection of the idea that India could be explained as being about aesthetics or aesthetic social judgment. In fact, at a particular point, and I'll just say Ambedkar as an example, makes a very strong argument that the problem with India is that aesthetic judgments of difference become social and moral orders that are enforced. So I'm curious about both the intellectual and the let me just say the programmatic value of a pushback to aesthetics. I sense that it has some work to do, but I'm curious what that work might be. So, and I'll go to Pavel's point and try and draw a thread through this. At a certain point in social theorizing about difference in India, purity pollution indices get drawn up as being some kind of master explanatory framework. And I think this is quite well known, and there are many variations on this, Central Indian, South Indian, North Indian, and across the different caste identities and tribal identities. And my sense is that when we think about the Northeast, um, the, the purity pollution index breaks down in some ways in what you explained to us, in that there is a certain sense in which the Northeast disrupts the primary purity pollution index as it worked in mainland India dealt with central Indian tribes, which faced the worst of exclusion and violence. The Northeast somehow puts some pressure on a single purity pollution index, right? Except for questions of food. You mentioned food and other forms, but it's interesting that the Northeast presents a different kind of problem in this common index. What is striking to me, though, from what you were saying, was that gender identity generally escapes at least historical explanations of purity pollution. There's no gender identity. And what I sense is that the Northeastern cultures, and you cautioned us that it's not one culture, it's many cultures, have better ways of accommodating variations and difference in gender identity than mainland India. There's some purchase there, maybe, for the point that you made that, look, there are many cultures, and we're not here just to assimilate, because these cultures may actually have a lot to teach mainland Indian culture about how to accommodate gender identity in different ways. And I don't want to say more. I'm sure you've thought and worked through these questions considerably, so I'll leave it at that. And to Grace, I mean, when we were thinking about the way caste breaks down, say, in southern Tamil Nadu or South India more generally, is there some intellectual resource, a writer or a group of writers, or is there some movement dynamic that is actually changing this? I mean, where do you see hope? Do you see someone at least writing and understanding the ways in which caste and, say, trans identity interact, even if it's not happening in the world? At least they're writing about it, they're thinking about it, in any language or in any social grouping, or do you actually see movement solidarities happening? And if it would be very interesting, I think, for the audience to hear that yes, there are a lot of things that are not happening, but maybe there's some interesting things happening here, and we might want to pay more attention to it. So shall I hand it over back to you, Brian, to go first?
Sure. I missed part of the question in the haze of it being 6:43, so I'll answer as best I can. I think part of my thinking about this question is it strikes me as Ambedkar is sort of understanding a kind of a discreteness, right, in some ways between the category of aesthetics and sort of morality. For me, right, if I think about morality, and again, I have a very perverse relationship to philosophy, so I apologize if I offend philosophers in the audience. I don't necessarily believe in the kind of great man philosophical tradition of from so on beget so who begets so. But I think that even in the idea of what morality is, right, goodness or badness, if I'm using a very base kind of definition here, that's equally an aesthetic question, right? That's a question that is shaped by questions of beauty, right? And I think beauty here, not simply as kind of visuality, but beauty as imagined forms of collective or even individual sort of thriving, right? So it's these kinds of aspirational states. And I think that for me, that really, the language of aesthetics helps me talk about how when people are expressing sort of anti-Black sentiment or thought, that what they're tapping into is a kind of a gesture to the things that they find undesirable. And I think the best example I can give, right, and I don't talk about it, and I didn't talk about it in this talk, is again, I'll talk about it again, right, Priyanka Chopra's fashion, right? That scene where she wakes up in a panic because she has accidentally slept with an African man, right, is to me about these kinds of questions that are deeply tied to aesthetics. It makes sense, right? Because we're supposed to sort of like fear the Black man as this kind of like silent monster that's right sleeping next to her. He never says a word in the film. He has no presence other than just being this trope. And I think that that image, right, is why this project is one of the many images I'm thinking with in terms that sort of speaks, for me at least, as to why this project has to have a sharpened engagement with aesthetics. I hope that like somehow answers your question. I apologize.
I take that right away. So the way you're using aesthetics is as this kind of meta category that subsumes all of the other philosophical judgments. Yeah, take that.
Like I said, perverse.
I will start, but I'm going to ask Jay Santa if she can also add in because I think she has done extensive work on that. Um, so yeah, so so um, so I think it's sort of a give and take situations that we have to do. There are certain perspectives which is there in Northeast that I think the mainland Indians can sort of like benefit from the way they look at it. It's not just different though, but I guess it's perspectives that we were talking about, acknowledgement mostly to begin with, and also because I think like people who do come out of that region and has been in these big cities as we call it, when they go back, they do take a lot of things from these cities as well, and that has led on to developments in that region, not just in terms of the people who are making policies and like certain, when you talk about a certain cultural changes or development happening in a region, it could be through policy program or it could be a social cultural changes coming from the people on their own, from exposures that they're getting on their own, except for the policy makers presiding on us. So there, yes, so people who has come out of there has been able to get out of that little like space. And also, I mean, if we had not migrated, we would also be trapped in our own sense of world and not been able to see what else exists out there, which we did. After we migrated, we went back with different perspectives. The same I think the mainland can do. For example, um, love marriage. Love marriage as opposed to arranged marriage open up to a certain possibilities of how the marriage do not necessarily become a very essential goal of you in your adult life. And I think in Hindu philosophy, like the marital phase is considered as one big part of your transition into your moksha or whatever. So I think that is where I also come in, because back in Northeast, it's not like if you fall in love, you want to, because love marriage is a norm. So you found somebody to fall in love, then you get married. Otherwise, it's okay. Nobody's going to say anything to you about it. But I guess now it's a little different because now arranged marriage is also sort of step in. And as I say, now it's so difficult to sort of differentiate between what is the influence from becoming from India as well as what is indigenous there. It all exists side by side. But if we go back a little bit, if you go back, then I don't think this couplehood or heteronormative couple, for that instance, was not such a big thing like that, such that it governs the process of your life. If it happens, it happens. You fell in love with someone, fine. Otherwise, there were so many things, for example, I think here in mainland India, to get married, and not just in mainland India, but I think this is a very thing, like to get married seems to be a goal for everybody. But I guess like back at it, I mean, in Manipur, I guess that's really not. Or if we trace back 50 years back or something, it's really not. There's so many things that people can sort of explore and talk about spaces, queer spaces where trans people have found spaces. Yes, the hijra culture has been there. The hijra legacy has been there for a long time, serving a lot of purpose for different like rulers and different cultures and different eras and different different times. But let's look at the kind of space where they're given. Yes, there is a certain big part of myth is associated with it. They are given some space within the spiritual world and all of that. But if I have to take an example of Nupa Maibi, then Nupa Maibi is actually above the people. And Nupa Maibi are trans women, non-binary, gender non-binary, male assigned at birth, and they're above the people. So if we compare the Hijra status and Nupa Maibi status is actually above the humans. And they are the connect to the gods. So they so sort of, it's not just fear of them. There's a lot of respect for them also, which is replaced by the word homo in the recent past with the HIV and all of this, and like all this thing coming in and homo becoming that word, and now it's trans. I mean, the transgender identity is seen with a certain loathsome perspective now, but that's not an indigenous perspective. Um, um, then if I have to talk about gender roles, because the point is when we are trying to dismantle heteronormativity, and also as we talk about all this like hierarchy and hegemonies that is existing between us, transgender populations, like transgenders community, if we are, that is also sort of trickling down from that patriarchy and heteronormativity internalized, certain things we still need to unpack in a lot of ways. So one thing that the mainland community can learn, I don't want to comment much on South Indian, but I can comment on North India because Haryana, Punjab, and sort of know a little more about them. Is this shared responsibility? The fact is, if you look at the fields of Haryana, women work as much as men. But how much of their work is acknowledged and how much it is not acknowledged? And culturally so. If you go to Northeast, every work is acknowledged. And that is where this uh, this assumptions also comes in, that in Northeast of India, it is more gender equal or egalitarian, which again, I think Santa will also deny. I will also deny, saying that, again, things like exhibit itself in different ways. Of course, it's not gender egalitarian in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things to be dealt with, but that is how the patriarchy and the male privilege, like sort of like um, male privilege. For example, there is a lot of mar- for, for women to marry outside of their own community is not, encouraged, or women to go out of the bound of the family, or women to go out of the country to study and all of that. But if we talk about, say, somebody in Haryana or somebody in Delhi, if you are born in Delhi and if you say that my daughter is going to a certain, like country to study, it will be a sense of pride for you, but not for people in Manipur. So the women there has to face with this, like in terms of their access and mobility. But in terms of being acknowledged for their capacities, for their work, for their capabilities, in terms of this everyday roles and responsibilities, they are given that acknowledgement there. So that's why it sounds a little more egalitarian in that way. Love marriages to exist sort of looks like a egalitarian way, but as what, this is what I'm trying to say. So I would, if I made an impression that the Northeast community or Northeastern region are more gender egalitarian, then I'm really sorry. I would like to take it back. Rather, the point is this, that it has to be a give and take. Something that I don't have, I will take from you. Something that you don't have, you'll take from me. Let us influence each other. And that is what I would say. And yeah, and if Jay Santa wants to add on anything. Okay.
The important issues that I have been trying to address in big forums, and it was really wonderful. And the thing about gender plurality in the indigenous community, now the indigenous community in the entire Northeast region is really polluted. It's, the sanctity, what we call indigeneity, has completely lost. Because in the Artswell Manipuri society, there was a community called Faida, and there were non-conforming peoples. But actually, in my research, I did not use the word non-conforming because it comes from the Western context. So in order to bring out a very inclusive society, I took the name as gender plurality. So it was there, and the existence of this community was very much visible since 16th century. And after Vaishnavism comes, and then Burmese invasion, and then British colonization, layers of colonization, the history was completely destroyed, and their institution in the Kangla, the palace of the Meitei kings, their existence was totally, completely annihilated. So like what comes after that was the Nupa, maybe what she had said. It's a spiritual community. And also even these peoples are belongs to the non-binary peoples. But they are not able to come out as with their own identity because of the male control. Manipur is a very conservative and then male-dominant society, like what Pavel have said, because like sometimes we are like it's difficult to say, but actually sometimes we also whitewash the realities, because when you talk about Manipur Maina Paibi, women carrying torches, but in reality, these women's their space has been appropriated by the male chauvinists. So they have been treated like a gun-proof for the women, and it's a long history. So these are the things, and then about this fight also, uh, in my research, I did not try to legitimize with the religion and the culture, because otherwise, when you legitimize gender identity with the culture and religion, you lost the sanctity and the originality of your gender identity. Because, for example, in India, we have seen, I have friends, she is Maharashtrian. She was very sexy once upon a time, wearing short things, and then she was very crazy. Now look at her. Red vermilion on the forehead, and then people's coming to touch her feet. So that's how we have lost our identity. And also it has led to the destruction in the community unification. So that was the whole thing that's happening. But it's true, in the earlier indigenous community, the gender pluralities was there, and the society was very inclusive. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Um, yes, that intellectuals who are writing about the caste within the trans movement, I think me and Living Smile Vidya only raised this issues. Living Smile Vidya now she's not in this country, and she's in Switzerland, I think so. I don't know. But I'm the only person who raised these issues, and our trans rights now collective. We are doing, we are educating the trans community, and especially Dalit Adivasi trans community persons, because we strongly believe the education is more important for us. Education, it's giving a long way for us, and whatever way life we want to live, uh, the education is the basement for us. So we strongly believe that. So that's why we are demanding reservational rights, because when we get the reservational rights, um, that is, it's not a temporary solution, it's a permanent solution for us. People like us, who wants to continue their studies, who wants to uh, get educational rights. So that's why we demanding the reservation rights. And um, nobody write about these issues, because all the people are focusing, as I said, the people who have the privilege, all the people are focusing that issues. But within the queer movement, within the trans movement, we have so many intersectionality peoples, like, especially Dalit disability trans, disability trans women, trans men, and they don't know what are their rights, and how do we approach the administrative officers, and they don't know even how to write a letter, the request letter to uh, give the administrative peoples. And this is what happening in the ground level reality. And our trans rights now collective educating them, the people who wants to continue their education, and we are supporting them, and we are encouraging them, we are supporting the financially and the legally with CLPR team. uh, and our success is Tariga Banu case. Tariga Banu is a Dalit trans woman, and she got a very less mark in the higher education. And we fought in front of the court, and we got justice. Finally, now she's doing higher education. It's a medical field. And the hope, we are having the hope. In our hand, we have a constitution, Baba Sahib Ambedkar constitutions. We are going to fight to get our rights. and every day we are fighting to get our rights. So constitution, Baba Sahib, constitutions giving so much hope for us.
Thank you. So we have time for one more round. Yes, please. We can take 3 questions. It's working.
Is this audible?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I have a similar question for Pavel and Brian. So while Pavel was talking about the increase of modernization and how it has influenced the Northeastern community, has modernization also led to more members within the Northeastern community be comfortable about their gender identity and coming forward as transgender individuals? Like, has the community grown significantly due to modernization, or there is just historical cultural past that has already been significant in terms of that influence? Similarly to Brian, in terms of Brian's research here, has it been that a lot of members of the African American community that come to India are also very open about their gender identity in terms of if do they freely recognize as trans individuals or not, or are they more or have you come across any kind of hurdles that they face in terms of being open about their gender identity in your research on the field? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just look around.
Hi. Uh, at the peak of the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, there was a period where a lot of queer, a lot of queer people had put up like Black Lives Matter Instagram stories, and like and when it came to the Hathras incident, like took an either took a completely silent approach, or like uh, 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 took a very casteist approach. I'm sorry, the neutral approach there is casteist. So they took a casteist approach. What do you have any comments on this?
Do we have another one? Yes. Vaijayanti, to close. Sorry, you had the question?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm definitely to the Vajanti.
Okay. Okay. Vaijayanti, go on. Vikviram can be quick and
Okay.
close.
Okay, I'll be quick as well. So very recently I chanced upon, and this is a question to Grace and also perhaps to Brian. I don't know how much of they work with the private sector. I chanced upon a certain diversity questionnaire with a Wall Street giant like Oracle that had, and this was for those candidates who were trying to get hired online, you know, for them to upload their resumes online. And the diversity questionnaire has a certain field that drops into a dialog box, caste, and the drop-down box says OBC, SC, ST. One of my trans daughters in the matrilineal system, who is a trans woman from the Dalit background, she's Dalit, she had to populate that she's SC, with questions coming up into her mind as to the private sector is clearly not into affirmative action or reservations. Why on earth would they want my caste? One. Two, the same diversity questionnaire of Oracle, and I'm naming it as Oracle, has the word, it's also asking for disability, and the word it uses there is, are you physically challenged? So, and we're talking about a Wall Street giant like Oracle. Then it also goes on to caste, caste, gender. And under gender, it wants to capture person's gender, and the options on the drop down are male, female, undisclosed. So this is clearly not what we expect of highly privileged Wall Street giants sitting on mountain piles of prosperity, mountain piles and profits of prosperity, where they don't even care to find out what the difference between gender and biological sex. And your thoughts on that, Grace, because in the space of livelihoods and employment, we have to deal with the private sector, the public sector shrinking. Thank you.
Quick, sorry. Quickly to Pavel, I'm really, it's remarkable what you've just shared with us. So it's really just to ask you to speak more. We continue to frame there is a way in which what you've said perhaps can be framed as if the encounter with the Northeast is purely cultural, but it's also one of the military, right? And I want you to kind of think for me and with us together about what self-determination means in that kind of context, right? It's a term that's kind of we continue to exercise in our organizing against the Trans Act. And I want to kind of think about if you have any thoughts about the idea of self-determination, especially because of the deeply militarized region, right? It's not just a cultural category, it's a military category, it's a border state, and so on and so forth. Brian, I have a slight provocation. I'm wondering if you would take seriously Priyanka Chopra's marriage as you would her fashion disaster, which is that would you consider her marriage to whiteness as Jonas' brother as part of the project of the continuation of the anti-blackness, right? Where does whiteness as an aesthetic problem disrupt the presencing of blackness in India? And I want to therefore also suggest that would, as an aesthetic problem, would pornography be a place where you could think of the embeddedness of the categories of violence and beauty together, especially considering that we are one of the largest markets for consumption of pornography, where categories like black and white circulate in very particularly aesthetic registers. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 4 questions. Maybe we go back to Grace starting.
I'm going to answering the first question, the silence. When the Black Lives Matter it's happened in the all around the world, yes, I also put in the black violence. But when the same thing it's happened, but most of the upper caste people and people from the Dalit movements and the feminist movements, the various kind of movements, they gave their solidarity to the our brothers and sisters. But when the same it's happened to the Hathras case, the most of the feminist movement, not all the movement, the most of the feminist movement and all are occupied by the upper class Savarna women. And the civil society also keeping their silence is a solidarity. So when the atrocities happen against us, mostly we are getting the response from the civil society, it's a silence. But when the atrocities happen against somebody nearby, my brother or sister, our voice is the first voice to give the solidarity for them, our sisters. But here it's completely casteist, and that's why we said, that's why I said, break your silence, because your silence is one of the apartheid for us. And that Vaijayanti questions, the private sector. Yes, we are demanding, one of our demand also, you should follow the reservation system in the private sector also. Because we don't have a privilege to go to the private sector offices. So these people are, as you said, you gave the example, Dalit trans women who try to apply, but they are showing like it's a casteist mentality, upper class Savarna people mentality. Even so many upper class feminists and the upper class people are saying they they are going to visit the Dalit people home, and they are sitting with there, and they are eating with them. So they take a photos, and they put in the social medias. Hey, look here. Uh, I'm sit with the Dalit people. I'm eating with the Dalit people. I'm in the Dalit house. So this all it's completely casteist thoughts. So um, that's and it's the private sector. Most of the private sectors are doing like this only. So the private sector also, the corporate also have a class and caste.
Thank you, Chris. Tamal?
I want to answer your question first. I think it's a mix of both, and yeah, because so the spaces for non-binary people, I think I spoke very generally during my time, but I think the questions I'm going to answer from a very gender non-conforming, non-binary, transgender identity context. It is both. So if you look at when we shared about Faida, and that it was a spiritual space, but how many people can they accommodate, right? Just looking at its space, shaman culture, and how many people can be a priest, right? Because it is not something which is open to all. Then came a time when it became when Shumang Lila, which is also very similar to the Jatra, like culture in Bengal, they came in. So then it opened up a cultural space, and few more people can be accommodated in it, because we're talking about performance as a space where people can express, people can like a male assigned bird can. But I think we are still talking about trans for those male assigned bird. It became a cultural space. So from Faida, which was a lot more restricted space, even though it was above the human world, but cultural, then coming in of the Sumang Lila, the Jatra type, which is a cultural space for a few people coming in, and then come at times which is known as the Seven Sisters time, and Archie Santa is one of the Seven Sisters at that time. What they did was created an economical space, a space to earn money. So what Seven Sister did was, so there was this a lot of mela that used to happen, and they used to have this thing called Chitrahar. And mostly in Chitrahar, what happens is Bollywood music will be played, and and a lot of people will be performing to it. Then the point is, at one point of time, I think Manipuri women doing that would be seen as offensive. So what Che Santa and her friends did was they formed a group called Seven Sister, who started doing it as a trans person, and they became very popular, and that opened up a space where transgender is seen as serving another function in the everyday fabric of the life, from spiritual to cultural to entertainment. And from there, from Seven Sisters, they just and the entrepreneurship came into it, I think, and then they sort of like directed that sort of attentions, and a lot of younger people, because when you talk about entertainment group, it can be much more widespread, a lot more people can come into it. And also a part of it is also associated, because the point is, when you dress up for the jatra, you cannot really experiment with beauty tactics, because you have to look like how you see, but then in Chitrahar, there were so many ways in which you can sort of, like experiment with beauties and ideas on makeup and all of that. And then I think from then on, what happened is what we know now, how beauty industry in Manipur is taken over by the trans women. So I think that is purely like the community, at the same time modern, like amenities and technologies and innovations and modern ideas as well, because these are not something that originated in Northeast, but these are also influence coming in into Northeast from different parts of the country or the world, and then the community is sort of using those, like influences into something that they can build upon. And to speak about the trans men community, it started off with the, I think again, it's also because state has a certain role to play in it, but I still don't want to give state any sort of credit on it, because home guard, which is basically constable sort of, that became the space for a lot of trans, gender non-conforming female assigned birth people to apply and it gives them a source of sustenance. It also and they're also living away from home because they will also live in quarters, and there, also give spaces for them to find like-minded people, to fall in romantic relationship, form romantic alliances, and later on, and as slowly, and so that was the beginning of it. And then I guess by the time Amana came into being, I think like the whole discourse on human rights and everything has already came in, and then Amana sort of like was the supporting group that also led on to formation of ETA, enabling transability, and from ETA to various other trans men groups there. So that is my answer to you. To my answer for so basically, yeah. So, and when I talk about non-binary people as of now, because I think non-binary is something very recent, and even for people back at home also, because if you see trans men and trans women as a category are very discrete again, and they're very like, non-binary. It's not just about being non-conforming, it's about identifying within the binary in a lot of ways. But there are lots of young people back at that time also, for those people back at the time who do not necessarily identify with the binary as a trans woman or a trans man, they couldn't again find spaces to congregate and get together. But now is the social media doing it for them, because a lot of informations are coming in, WhatsApp groups are being formed, and it's anonymous again, that safety thing coming in. So there's a lot of WhatsApp group there in Northeast, which where people are finding like-minded people. So again, spaces for non-binary people, non-binary young people, who want to experiment with your gender expression and gender presentation, but still want to take time to figure out or to settle down with a certain gender identity, or maybe they want to remain as that, a gender fluid person. So again, like that way. Yeah, opening up social media, opening up possibilities, and bringing in a lot of informations. As for the questions by Vikuram. Thing is, so COVID and the situation, pandemic, it may be very new to the entire country, but it's not so new to us, because Northeast, and particularly Manipur is the one in which conflict, it's still conflict ridden. So we have this, I remember in my childhood, there was like 6-7 months of no schools because there was this, the ceasefire between all, and there, the disruption into this everyday life about like buns and curfews for months at a row. This time around when pandemic happened, everybody is like, oh, and then all of us Northeastern people were like, we can deal with it. We've seen it in our lives. Nothing new, that way. So what happens? So it's not new to us. So what it does is that, so what such kind of this disruption into everyday life does is, again, let's talk about, when we talk about self-determination, one thing I want to mark is that um, you need to be in a certain space of sanity and peace and harmony to be able to look to the future. When fear looms over you throughout the time, when tomorrow is so unpredictable, you don't know if there's going to be a bomb blast in your area the next day. You don't know when your army is going to come and attack you, even though that hasn't happened in the recent past. But for a very long time in that region, what militarization did was a lot of just, it was not a conflict-ridden state just because we wanted to be a conflict-ridden state. Maybe we wanted self-determinacy. Maybe some group, indigenous group, came up as this revolutionary group who was not so happy with the annexation of the region into the country, which I guess the people mainlander doesn't know about it. It was not like we coming to Indian, like state and saying we want to be part of it. Representatives, the monarch sort of at that time were called upon, not monarch basically, but because during British rule, the monarchy had sort of dissipated, but there were still, chosen heads. So what happened is when British left in the northeastern part of India, British left in this contract that India would look after the Northeast until they become, self-determinant on their own, because we're talking about China at our border. We're talking about Myanmar at our border. But what happens is that this selective, the monarch at that time were called upon, Shillong, was it Shillong, Chesanta? Yeah, they were called there, and then they were at the gunpoint, they had to sign this annexation into the Indian state. And what happens after that is this influx of militarization on the basis of what? When that news came to the people started congregating to sort of fight, so sort of say, of course, because suddenly you see that one big state has sort of like taken over your custody, then people are a little afraid of what's going to happen. So they started forming, like these groups, which is going to think about their self-determinancy, how they will not fall into, the grasp of this big power. That's when militarization happened. And because of that, and after the militarization, the militarization and this whole thing was used by Indian state to inflict that region with conflicts and through abductions, through all those history. So when your mind is not free of what will happen the next, how can you actually think of future? Because I think self-determinancy needs to come from a space of peace and like harmony, and this cultural hegemony, or not just, and then so first and foremost thing is the annexation also comes with a cultural hegemony, which again was cultural hegemony is something very abstract, but militarization, which is what is very physical and real. So you know how you've been taken over. And how does it affect the self-determinancy of the trans community there is this. When UPSPA is still considered as the main important thing that you need to deal with, when you are so hopeless that UPSPA will be removed, talking about gender sexuality or equality was seen as something so trivial. How can you talk about it when UPSPA is there? So that also like kept this kind of discourse away from the region from a very long time. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thanks, Pavel. Brian, to close.
Yes, can everybody hear me again?
Yes.
And quickly, again, I just wanted to thank everybody for taking time to sit with me and with these kinds of new thoughts that I'm putting out into the world. I wanted to start with Vijayanti's question about the surveys. I actually think, even though this wasn't necessarily directly addressed to me, I think it points to a larger problem and provocation that I think the conference is and should be sitting with, and that is, right, what does this work of inclusion do? Who is inclusion for? Because I think that often the kinds of categories that you're describing, these sort of ill-fitting surveys, are about a kind of corporate posturing, right? Or about people being able to feel good about the work that they're doing rather than actually doing good work. I think, again, if you think about this in the language of, say, for instance, the trans bill, this is precisely that kind of like, we are going to take it upon us to give for you and do for you what we think is right. And I think that, again, we're encountering the same issue, right? Which is that the center of the conversation is not actually the people who need to be centered. It is the feelings of cis folks, of Suvarna folks who are centered. And so I think I really want to highlight what you've said, because it's really important for moving away from, or at least starting a conversation that moves away from a notion of inclusion that's just kind of this like additive sort of framework, like let's just put more names on a list and not actually think consciously about the kinds of violence and the kinds of power that we enact, even in having the privilege of listing people's caste identities or gender identities. So the question about, and I'm going to answer these out of order. So there was a question about kind of like if Africans are allowed to sort of be more free in expressing their gender identities in India. I think that was one of the questions that was posed. I apologize if I misheard it. I think for me, this question is a bit of a challenge for me, both in terms of just, it's not something I've seen yet, in terms of the data that I'm looking at. I haven't gotten to do my full round of like deep engaged field work. But I will say, from what I do know and from what I have seen and from the things I have looked at, that I think this question of gender freedom or gender expression to me is like a non-starter, only because I think, right, if we're talking about communities of people that are fundamentally dehumanized in terms of the ways in which they are imagined in occupying everyday space. I mean, just look at the ways in which African women are sort of treated and spoken about, right? The category of gender is a category that exists in some ways, right? Following some sort of category of humanity. And I think that reading the kinds of stories that are out there in the world about the ways in which African sex workers, for instance, are treated, to me suggests that like we can't even have this conversation on gender until we can have some sort of a conversation on personhood. And I'm really thinking here, for those of you who are students, in the vein of kind of what Hortense Spillers, who's a sort of very prominent Black feminist critic, is sort of thinking about when she's talking about the category of Black woman as it operates in the US, right? That if Black people in general have suffered, right, generations of systematic dehumanization, then what does it mean to try to call together this notion of a Black womanhood as a figure, right? If we're not even having the conversation about sort of inhumanity and inhumane treatment. VQ, I think these are fabulous questions, and I am going to kind of, I think that the question about gender identity sort of makes me think about this question that you've asked about porn, which is really important. And I take that provocation. I've actually thought for quite some time about how, and in fact, part of my project is thinking about pornographic representation. I have this whole dream of just doing a whole chapter for this next book, talking about the ways in which gay men sort of talk about categories of race in digital spaces, because I think that so much of the things that you're pointing to emerge there, right? And so emerge in this context in which there's a kind of consumption of Black bodies in sort of these very sexual, erotic contexts that actually doesn't serve to produce a kind of notion of respect or humanness, but actually reinstates certain forms of like racialized violence. And so I take that provocation really centrally. To Priyanka, you're absolutely right that her marriage in some ways is about speaking to a kind, listen, I'm not gonna like comment on like people's like love and who loves, like love is a myth. But I will say that like I do think that her marriage in some ways, you're right, allows her to occupy particular positions of privilege in which she can move back and forth between being a racialized subject in the US who isn't imagined as Black because of her proximity to whiteness, but then when she comes to India can sort of present herself as a kind of good social justice warrior who's doing the work of sort of anti-racist thought and anti-racist politics in India. And I think that it speaks precisely to the sort of slippages that both Grace and Pavel mentioned, which is, right, what does it mean that if we take Priyanka, for instance, she can post hashtag Black Lives Matter, but hasn't spoken about any of the major atrocities that have happened to Dalits, to Muslims. She hasn't posted about CAA, NRC. She said very little. And I think that that, to me, speaks to, right, the ways in which she can sort of, the phrase some people use is kind of skin changing, right? You can sort of take on and take off race as it suits you. But saying that, getting to this question about like posting, right? What does it mean that like young sort of urban upper class activists are posting hashtag BLM? I actually found myself quite frustrated in a lot of the sort of things I was seeing online over the summer when Movement for Black Lives was kind of erupting, not least of all because I think, yes, I agree with the point that there is a kind of silence on issues that are domestic. But at the same time, I also want to be weary of this idea that what someone puts on the internet or what someone posts is a kind of authentic presentation of their sort of politics and is itself authentic political speech. I think a lot of the people I saw who posted, like my frustration was that people who were posting things like hashtag Black Lives Matter were posting them because Bollywood celebrities were posting them. Were posting them because their favorite kind of intellectual heroes were posting them, but had no context, I think, for why they were making those posts. And the example I'll give is that in almost none of the content that I saw was there any mention of the kinds of atrocities that are happening to Africans in India. So it was, again, writing hashtag Black Lives Matter, what does that mean when we're not even having a conversation about what's happening in places like Bangalore or Delhi or Bombay? So if that is the kind of threshold for political speech and solidarity, I don't want that. And I think a lot of people and a lot of Black people globally wouldn't want that, right? The kind of erasure of domestic forms of anti-Black racist violence in the service of just a kind of feel-good post. And I think that for me, I take the point that there is often a strategic erasure of Dalit and Adivasi issues in India. But I would also add that that same erasure applies to Black folks, even in the ways in which speech or talking is supposedly or ostensibly about Black people. I think you could, and I think that that to me was made sort of very relevant, very obvious in what was happening over the summer. And the last thing I'll add is that I think even the kinds of like, what about posts that I saw where people were calling out other people for not posting about domestic issues, right? Like I saw a post that said things like Black lives don't matter in India, we should be talking about caste. I agree, we should be talking about caste, but we should also be talking about the kinds of violences that are happening to Black people in India, because those things are not fully separate. There are very much spaces of intertwined connectivity that are worth pulling apart and talking about productively. And I don't think that productive conversation happens at the end of a hashtag or a tweet. I don't know that 140 characters is enough to really give the kind of fullness to the experiences of Dalit, Adivasi, Black, and other folks who are being marginalized. So I really want to thank you all for giving me time. I'm sad I can't see anybody's faces, so it's like, I appreciate the questions. I thank you all for inviting me.
Thanks, Brian. So I think we're at 6 o'clock now, and we have some mementos. Brian, we'll have to find some way of reaching these to you, but for the speakers who are up on the dais, Almas, please. So I think we're done for the day, and we start tomorrow morning at 9:30 with registrations and 10 o'clock for the first panel. Thank you all for staying the extra time, and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Brian. Thank you.
Another announcement, there's tea and coffee available outside after that long day.